What happens when the woman you threw away like street dust turns out to own the entire financial empire you've been secretly borrowing from for 5 years? Evelyn Prescott stood silently in the dark, watching her ruthless mafia husband and his arrogant family treat her like absolute nothing. They thought she was a helpless nobody, wholly dependent on their criminal name. So, they orchestrated a massive public humiliation, throwing her out into a midnight storm with nothing but a single suitcase. But as the heavy iron gates slammed shut behind her, her true empire woke up. Her father as private armor arrived, and the global financial press exploded with a truth that left the entire underworld paralyzed. This story is not just a tale of magnificent corporate vengeance. It is a masterclass in emotional discipline, strategic patience, and the undeniable power of a woman who knows her worth when the world refuses to see it. If you want to learn how real power operates in absolute silence, without ever needing an audience, stay until the very last word. Smash that like button. Drop your city in the comments below, and subscribe to become part of our elite community. Let's see how far this empire travels. The storm had been building over Lake Tahoe since mid-afternoon. The kind of weather that arrives like a warning nobody listens to. By 9 o'clock, it had turned savage. Rain came sideways off the water, hammering the cliffside Moretti estate with a violence that rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows and made the candles on the outdoor terraces gutter and die one by one inside the fortified compound. However, none of that mattered. The massive crystal chandeliers burned bright, the champagne flowed ice cold, and the music played on with a decadent, unbothered rhythm. A string quartet was positioned in the corner of the grand entrance hall, their bows moving with mechanical precision through something classical and expensive that absolutely nobody in the room was actually listening to. The air inside was thick with the scent of high-end perfume, expensive scotch, and the quiet, suffocating arrogance of New York's elite. Evelyn Prescott stood near the base of the main staircase and watched the room the way she had trained herself to watch rooms over the last 5 years. She stood quietly, completely taking inventory of the crowd without ever appearing to look directly at anyone. She counted exactly 43 guests. She knew the names of 31 and the specific business interests of 26. She recognized the two prominent senators drinking near the fireplace, one of whom had shaken her hand warmly at a high-profile function in Washington just 8 months ago. Tonight, that same senator looked directly through her as though she were nothing more than a part of the expensive wallpaper. She saw the three men from the rival Falcone operation standing near the mahogany bar, drinking too fast, their eyes nervously moving back to Luca every 90 seconds the way anxious men always check their compass in dangerous territory. Then, her eyes found Luca. He stood near the arched doorway that opened onto the main corridor, a crystal glass of scotch in one hand, his jaw set at that particular, rigid angle that meant he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. He was wearing the dark navy suit she had personally picked out for him 2 months ago for an executive dinner in Milan. He still hadn't noticed that small detail, or if he had, he hadn't said a word. That was fine with her. She had stopped keeping score of the small things 3 years ago, precisely when she realized the small things in this world were just the large things in disguise. Evelyn smoothed the front of her black, understated dress, the kind of garment that cost more than most people's monthly rent but announced absolutely nothing about itself. She lifted her glass of sparkling water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and waited. She was exceptionally good at waiting. Her father had taught her from childhood that the person who controls their patience is always the person who controls the room. And Charles Prescott was a man who had never once in his life allowed anyone else to set the tempo of a negotiation. He was the founder of Prescott Capital, a giant financial juggernaut with over $43 billion under active management. Evelyn had not spoken to her father in 4 years, ever since she walked away from that empire to marry Luca. She did not allow herself to think about that now. Nostalgia was a liability she couldn't afford. Suddenly, Vivian Moretti broke from the center of the room and moved toward her. She walked with the kind of deliberate, unhurried stride that aristocratic women use when they want you to understand that your impending discomfort has been formally scheduled. Vivian was 63, silver-haired, dressed in a deep, menacing burgundy. She carried herself with a particular brand of cruelty that easily gets passed off as elegance when there is enough blood money behind it. Two of her daughters-in-law flanked her at a distance, close enough to witness the impending execution, but far enough to claim they weren't directly involved if things turned messy. Evelyn set her water glass down on a passing server's tray and turned to face her with flawless composure. Vivian stopped exactly 2 feet away and looked her over the way a customs agent inspects suspicious luggage they already fully intend to tear open. She told Evelyn she looked tired, but it wasn't a question. It was an opening insult. Across the room, a cluster of guests glanced over, pretending to look at the artwork but catching every peripheral movement, their eyes moving toward the impending disaster, the way onlookers watch a house fire. Vivian's expression didn't change. She and the women of the Moretti family had refined the delivery of psychological damage to such a degree that the weapon remained entirely invisible until after the wound began to bleed. Without a shred of ceremony, Vivian announced that Luca had made a final decision. She claimed she wanted Evelyn to hear it in a public setting where there were people around, because she thought it might make the eviction easier to manage. Evelyn felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but it wasn't surprise. It was more like the specific, numbing sensation of watching a tragedy you have seen, coming for a very long time, finally arrive at the door. Vivian reached into the small, expensive clutch she carried and produced a folded document. It was legal-sized, cream-colored, and thick, with the heavy weight of formal paperwork. She held it out coldly, stating that the attorneys had finalized everything that afternoon, and Luca had signed the papers this morning. The room shifted its attention now, not all at once, but steadily, the way water inevitably finds a drain. The senators near the fireplace stopped their conversation entirely. The dangerous men from the Falcone operation went completely still, watching the public execution of the boss's wife. Even the string quartet seemed to soften their music imperceptibly, as though the musicians had sensed the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure and adjusted their instruments accordingly. Evelyn did not take the document immediately. She looked directly at Vivian's face, staring at the controlled satisfaction sitting just below the surface of that carefully maintained composure. Evelyn breathed in slowly through her nose, made herself count to 3, and then took the papers. She did not open them because she didn't need to. She already knew exactly what they said. She had known for months that this day was coming. She had read the shifting legal language, felt the warmth draining out of their house, and watched the silences grow longer and heavier between her and Luca until the literal space between them in a room felt like something physical you could press your hand against. She had known, but she had not left earlier because leaving would have meant admitting the last 5 years were a calculation that didn't balance, and her pride hadn't been ready for that. But she was ready now. She looked at her mother-in-law and said a flat, even, "Thank you." It cost her an immense amount of internal strength to keep her voice that steady, but she paid the price willingly. Vivian blinked in genuine confusion. Whatever dramatic reaction, she had been maliciously expecting tears, desperate protests, or the visible fragility of a broken woman caught without her armor. This cold indifference wasn't it. The cruel satisfaction in the older woman's expression flickered uncertainly as she weakly suggested Evelyn take time to review the terms. Evelyn simply repeated her even words, folded the thick document once, tucked it securely under her arm, and turned to walk toward the main entrance. She did not rush, maintaining a regal, unbothered pace across the polished marble floor. She did not look back at Luca, though she could feel his gaze burning into her from across the crowded room with the particular, paralyzed stillness of a man who has done something he already secretly knows he cannot undo. She did not look at the senators, the rival mafia capos, or any of the 43 guests who were now watching her exit in a stunned, breathless silence. She walked straight into the grand entrance hall, took her coat from the wide-eyed, stiff attendant near the door, and picked up her single suitcase, with her divorce papers tucked tightly under her arm and her dignity completely intact. Evelyn Prescott walked out through the heavy front doors of the Moretti estate and stepped directly into the raging storm. The freezing rain hit her immediately, cold, hard, and merciless. Within 10 steps down the stone path, it soaked entirely through her coat, plastered her dark hair flat against her face, and filled her shoes. Yet, she kept walking without a single flinch. The heavy iron gates parted for her automatically, some automated security sensor reading her departure. the exact way a cold building reads an unwanted body leaving its perimeter. She passed through them onto the dark, empty road beyond the massive estate walls, and the gate swung shut behind her with a heavy, booming metallic sound that echoed through the night like a definitive period at the very end of a sentence. She stood there alone in the dark and the pouring rain, listening to the faint music still playing inside the blazing house behind her. She knew the powerful and the terrible inside were already drinking their expensive liquor and pulling apart her sudden exit with the quiet relish of monsters who feed exclusively on other people's worst moments. But as she stood under the dark sky, her phone rang in her pocket. She pulled it out, the screen wet and blurry, but the name on the display was crystal clear. Harrison. Harrison Voss was her father's chief of staff, a man who had stood beside Charles Prescott for 22 years and served as the primary contact point for every significant communication that came out of Prescott Capital. He was the person her father sent when a message absolute required arrival without an ounce of ambiguity. Evelyn pressed the phone to her ear. Hearing his measured, precise voice cut through the sound of the wind, he informed her that her father's private aircraft had landed at Teterboro 40 minutes ago, that Charles was currently at the Park Avenue residence, and that he was asking if she needed immediate transportation arranged. Standing on the dark roads outside the Moretti prison, wet and discarded, Evelyn felt a massive shift in the universe. She told Harrison to arrange the transport, and he replied that a black SUV would be at her exact location in approximately 20 minutes. She hung up, put the phone back in her pocket, and stood still in the downpour. She let the rain do what it wanted with her for a moment because she was finally entirely alone. There was no one left to perform composure for, and she needed a second to feel the full weight of the last 5 years before she filed it away forever. She breathed in, straightened her spine, and gripped her suitcase firmly. And then Evelyn Prescott smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but a smile of total liberation. The low, grinding fear she had carried for months about what her life would look like on the other side of this marriage was completely gone. It had cut out like a dead frequency, leaving behind a silence that was clean, sharp, and lethal. She knew exactly what came next, and she was more than ready to reclaim her world. The black, unmarked armored SUV moved through the thick Manhattan traffic with a heavy, unstoppable momentum that mirrored the silent shift occurring inside Evelyn Prescott's world. Behind the heavily tinted, soundproof windows, the chaotic roar of the storm and the blaring horns of the New York streets were reduced to an absolute, vacuum-like silence. The interior of the vehicle smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished wood, a stark and grounding contrast to the freezing, sienna-tinted rain that continued to lash violently against the glass outside. Evelyn sat deeply in the plush rear seat, her posture fluid but unyielding, completely insulated from the elements that had tried to break her composure just 20 minutes prior. The overhead reading light cast a soft, clinical glow across her lap, where the thick, cream-colored divorce documents now lay completely unfolded. Her hands, despite the residual chill from the Lake Tahoe downpour, were perfectly steady as she turned the pages with a deliberate, slow rhythm, her mind dissecting the text with the razor-sharp precision of a seasoned auditor. The settlement terms drafted by the Moretti family's attorneys were exactly what she had anticipated, insultingly modest, bordering on a complete legal erasure of her existence. They had allocated her a fraction of a percent of the legitimate real estate holdings she had personally salvaged from federal compliance seizures, offering her a parting sum that was a blatant insult to her 5 years of absolute devotion and strategic genius. To any ordinary woman, a document like this would have been a declaration of war or a source of devastating heartbreak. But to Evelyn, it was merely invalidation of their profound ignorance. She turned to page 4, her eyes locking onto a dense, heavily fortified clause that attempted to bind her to a sweeping, non-disclosure agreement regarding any and all unspecified business activities conducted during the marriage. The language was aggressive, designed to legally muzzle her under threat of catastrophic financial penalties and public ruin, crafted by a legal team that assumed she would be too grateful for the scraps, too eager to cause no disruption in her departure, and wholly dependent on the name she had married into. A faint, lethal smile touched Evelyn's lips as she read the non-disclosure clause a second time, the soft light of the cabin reflecting the total absence of fear in her eyes. The low, Grinding anxiety that had lingered beneath her ribs for the past 8 months, the ambient worry of what the other side of this broken life would look like, vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, pristine clarity that felt almost holy. The Moretti family had built their entire strategy on a spectacular miscalculation. They had assumed the woman they were discarding was the same helpless, resourceless girl they had spent half a decade treating like dirt beneath their shoes. They didn't know that she had spent those 5 years deliberately keeping her true identity buried in the deep archives of American finance, allowing them to believe she was nobody so that she could build their foundation without their arrogance interfering with her blueprints. She folded the papers back up with a clean, decisive snap and set them on the seat beside her, her gaze drifting out toward the dark, rain-streaked skyline of the city she was about to reclaim. In the front seat, Harrison Voss kept his eyes fixed strictly on the road ahead, his driving as precise and unhurried as his voice had been over the phone. For over 2 decades, he had served as the primary gatekeeper for Prescott Capital, a man who moved through the highest echelons of global wealth without ever leaving a footprint, executing Charles Prescott's wills with an absolute, terrifying efficiency. He had not asked her a single question when she climbed into the vehicle soaked and coatless. He had simply handed her a heavy, dry wool blanket and adjusted the cabin's climate control without a word. That was the hallmark of the Prescott world, a realm where competence was assumed. Actions were immediate, and useless sentimentality was treated as a structural weakness. Evelyn appreciated the silence. It gave her the space to file away the ghost of Luca Moretti into a dark corner of her mind where it could no longer siphon her energy, transforming her residual anger into something much more utilitarian and cold. As the SUV smoothly descended into the private, subterranean parking garage of her father's Park Avenue residence, Evelyn watched the concrete pillars flash past, each one marking her deeper re-entry into a universe of unyielding gravity. This building did not advertise its existence. There were no grand signs, no performance of wealth, and no golden gates like the ones she had just left behind in Tahoe. The lobby above was constructed of dark, unpolished marble and low, ambient lighting, guarded by men whose posture and alertness made it obvious. They were operators trained far beyond the scope of traditional security. The elevator ride to the private triplex floor required a simultaneous biometric scan and a physical key encryption, a multi-layered security protocol that Evelyn had grown up around and had forgotten how effortlessly she could read. When the heavy brushed steel doors slid open directly into the private corridor, two more security details stepped aside instantly without being asked, their eyes lowering in a silent, instinctual recognition of her return. She stepped across the threshold and into the main living space. An enormous, vaulted room that remained mostly dark except for a single cluster of luxury lamps burning near the seating area at the far eastern wall. There, sitting in a wide leather armchair with a stack of complex sovereign debt documents in his lap, was Charles Prescott. At 71 years old, her father remained one of the most physically and intellectually imposing men she had ever seen in her life, possessing broad, iron-like shoulders and heavy hands that looked as though they had been built for a different, much harder century. His silver and iron hair caught the edge of the lamplight as he looked up from his reading glasses, which he immediately pushed up onto his high forehead, a familiar, calculated gesture that meant he was done analyzing numbers and was now analyzing a human being. He did not rise from his seat to greet her, nor did his stone-carved expression soften by a single millimeter as he took in her wet hair and bare shoulders. Evelyn walked across the vast room, her wet shoes leaving no sound on the heavy Persian rug, and sat directly in the leather chair across from him, refusing to offer a single word of explanation, apology, or emotional preamble. She knew her father would despise any display of fragility. He had spent 20 years designing her to be a successor, not a victim. She had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of seeing her broken by a mafia syndicate. She looked him dead in the eye and asked flatly how long he had known about tonight's public divorce execution, her voice perfectly matching the room's clinical atmosphere. Charles Prescott picked up his glass of low-ball bourbon from the small mahogany table beside him, swirled the amber liquid once, and stated calmly that he had known about the exact logistics of tonight 3 days ago, and had known about the systemic failure of her marriage for much longer. The admission didn't shock Evelyn. She simply absorbed the data point, her spine straightening against the leather of the chair, as she noted that he hadn't reached out to warn her or pull her out before the public humiliation occurred. Her father almost smiled a cold, humorless expression that merely bared his teeth before telling her that she hadn't wanted him to intervene. A statement that was completely, brutally fair. 4 years ago, when she had chosen Luca Moretti over the magnificent global trajectory her father had meticulously mapped out for her, she had done so with full, defiant knowledge of the cost. She had walked away from Prescott Capital, forfeited her immediate inheritance, and told Charles Prescott directly to his face that she didn't need his wealth because she was going to build something entirely her own. Her father had watched her walk into that locked room without uttering a single argument, choosing instead to simply wait, knowing with the absolute patience of a predator that the world she had chosen would eventually show its true, vicious colors. Now, after 4 years of absolute silence between them, the calculation was complete, and neither of them felt the need to waste breath on the years in between. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she delivered her first executive directives, stating clearly that she required an elite, ruthless legal firm by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, one that specialized entirely in regulatory dissolution and non-disclosure challenges. Then she paused, letting the silence stretch for 3 precise seconds before asking the only question that truly mattered: if the original offer he had made her before her departure still stood. Charles Prescott set his bourbon down with a heavy, deliberate thud, pulled his reading glasses completely off his forehead, and folded them with a terrifying, slow precision that signaled a total shift in his attention. He looked at his daughter with the absolute, unblinking intensity he reserved exclusively for sovereign acquisitions, telling her that if she took the seat, it would not be a safe advisory role or a decorative consultancy. She would return to Prescott Capital as his full, undisputed successor, taking the main chair to build and command the next generation of the $43 billion portfolio, exposing herself entirely to the public eye. He warned her that the Prescott name would be thrust violently in front of the Moretti name, that the financial press would tear into the details of her hidden marriage, and that the syndicate would ask dangerous questions about her time inside their organization. Evelyn did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She looked at her father and told him to let them ask, her voice carrying a cold, purposeful hunger that made the air in the room turn heavy. Charles Prescott studied her face for one final, silent moment, searching for any residual trace of the girl who had left for love, and finding only a titan ready for war. He gave a single, definitive nod of his head, told her welcome back to the firm, and stated simply that they had an immense amount of work to do. Without asking for permission, Evelyn reached across the small table, picked up her father's glass of bourbon, and drank the remaining amber liquid in one slow, deliberate swallow. Charles allowed it, his eyes tracking the cold resolve in her features as she set the empty glass back down with the exact same thud he had used. Neither of them said another word about the sacrifice, the heartbreak, or the slanders of the Moretti family, because that was not how power was handled in this house. Some things simply did not require the weakness of words when the strategic alignment was this absolute. Evelyn stood up, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the guest suite that Harrison had kept prepared for her. For 4 years, a room that had never been treated as a vacancy, but as an empire waiting for its ruler to return from exile. She did not sleep that night. By 2 o'clock in the morning, she had showered, changed into sharp, clinical clothes that the household staff had somehow already selected in her exact sizes, and seated herself at the expansive mahogany desk in her suite. She opened her laptop, the clean white glow of the screen illuminating her face as she initiated her private containment protocols. The non-disclosure clause was her immediate obstacle, but she had spent the last 2 years quietly cultivating contact numbers for 3 elite, independent attorneys from her previous life lawyers who owed their careers to her father but answered exclusively to her. She photographed every single page of the divorce document, routing the encrypted images through secure, untraceable servers to their private terminals, bypassing the traditional Prescott legal channels to ensure she maintained absolute personal leverage over her strategy. By 3 in the morning, Evelyn opened the second, much more dangerous file, a heavily encrypted, multi-layered document she had been constructing in total secrecy for the past 8 months. This file was a flawless, architectural blueprint of the entire legitimate infrastructure of the Moretti organization. It contained every corporate registry, every real estate investment vehicle in Delaware, every luxury hotel front in 4 major international cities, and a massive private equity structure with shell companies threaded through it like a nervous system. She had designed all of it. She had been the silent mind that took their chaotic, vulnerable cash flows and structured them into an unassailable, legitimate empire while their own legal teams were still struggling to understand basic federal compliance. She knew that she wasn't going to use these blueprints to actively destroy Luca. She had loved him once. She had no desire for a vulgar, loud revenge. Her strategy was far more elegant. She was establishing an unyielding doctrine of mutually assured disclosure. If Luca's family or attorneys ever attempted to enforce that NDA to erase her or ruin her reputation, she would release the structural keys to the federal regulators, making their survival completely untenable. She worked straight through the night, ignoring the silver tray of fresh coffee and food that a silent staff member left outside her door at 4 in the morning, her mind operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency of a supercomputer. By the time the sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows began to turn a pale winter gray, she had successfully mapped out her entire corporate re-entry framework. There were still cold relationships to warm up, a public profile to construct entirely from scratch after 5 years of deliberate invisibility, and a massive corporate announcement to stage. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting flat against the polished wood of the desk as she thought about Luca one last time, her mind analyzing his final expression as she had crossed his marble floor. He hadn't known she would walk out before the final act of his mother's cheap drama was finished. He had expected a confrontation, a scene that would allow him to maintain the illusion of control. Evelyn smiled coldly into the dawn light, knowing that real power never needs an audience, and that within 48 hours, the Moretti family would realize that when they threw her out into the storm, they had accidentally unsealed the vault that contained their entire existence. By 8:15 the following morning, the vast, wood panel study of Charles Prescott S. Park Avenue residence had been transformed into an elite war room. The thin, winter gray sunlight cut sharply through the heavy curtains, illuminating a long mahogany table that was already covered in dense legal files, encrypted tablets, and half-empty espresso cups. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table, her posture rigid, her dark hair pulled back into a flawless, professional knot that mirrored the absolute sharpness of her mind. She had not slept, yet her eyes held a lethal, focused clarity that signaled the true end of her 5-year exile. Across from her sat Harrison Voss, his pen hovering with mechanical precision over a legal pad, while 2 of the top corporate dissolution attorneys in the United States reviewed the paperwork Evelyn had compiled overnight. At the head of the table sat Diana Reese, the director of Prescott Capital's Private Intelligence Division, a woman whose entire career was built on knowing the exact financial secrets that sovereign governments tried to bury. Charles Prescott himself sat completely silent in his leather armchair at the far corner of the room, cradling a porcelain cup of black coffee, content to let his daughter command the floor because he knew the trap she was setting required her undisputed authority. The lead attorney, a senior partner named Garrett, who possessed the relentless energy of a man who treated crisis management as a competitive sport, slid a heavily annotated document across the polished wood toward Evelyn. He stated without preamble that the aggressive non-disclosure clause the Moretti family had tried to weaponize on page 4 was legally dead in the water. He explained that because the document had been presented under highly coercive public conditions, and because Evelyn had privately retained the original architectural data proving she built the assets from scratch, any attempt by Luca S. attorneys to enforce the silence would trigger an automatic federal inquiry into the Moretti Syndicate S banking relationships. Evelyn reviewed the attorney's notes with a slow, deliberate nod, her mind already moving past the legal skirmish to focus entirely on the grander macroeconomic chessboard. She didn't just want to evade their pathetic NDA. She wanted to leverage the revelation of her true identity to completely paralyze the Moretti family's financing pipelines before they even realized she had stepped onto the field. Diana Reese leaned forward, sliding a sleek crimson folder across the table, her voice dropping to a precise, unbothered whisper that carried the immense weight of her department's capabilities. She informed Evelyn that the ideal platform for her corporate re-entry was already scheduled for exactly 3 weeks from Saturday, the 11th annual Winter Legacy Gala. It was a legendary Prescott tradition, an exclusive, high-security event that gathered every prominent politician, industrial CEO, and foreign dignitary within the American financial hierarchy. Evelyn looked down at the closed folder, her fingers tapping the leather edge with an unhurried cadence as she asked Diana, who was currently on the verified guest list. Diana's expression remained a flawless mask of professional neutrality as she replied simply, "Everyone." Evelyn understood the profound strategic subtext of that single word because she had spent 5 years building legitimate corporate fronts for the Moretti organization. Several of the international banking executives on that list maintained massive, unexamined debt positions with Luca's shell firms. A calculated, icy resolve settled deep within Evelyn's chest as she looked around the room, commanding Garrett to expand the current gala guest list by exactly 30%, insisting on reviewing and approving every single invitation personally. She declared that they would not slip back into the corporate world through a quiet, localized press release. They would make the formal succession announcement at the gala itself, turning a charity event into an absolute execution of her terms. Garrett's pen flew across his notepad, underlining the directive twice, while Harrison Voss made a silent notation in his ledger. The elite team instantly recalibrating to match the lethal tempo she was setting. Charles Prescott set his coffee cup down with a heavy, deliberate clink, looking at his daughter with an expression of profound, terrifying satisfaction. For 4 long years, he had been a patient predator, waiting for his chosen heir to shed the weakness of sentimentality. And looking at Evelyn now, he knew the sovereign titan he had designed was finally ready to take the throne. 3 days later, the first phase of Evelyn's structural campaign was launched with devastating, clockwork precision. Diana Reese's intelligence team orchestrated a calculated leak to the financial press, publishing a series of high-resolution photographs that showed Evelyn stepping out of a black Prescott Capital SUV outside the firm's Midtown Tower. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal coat, her hair styled up, surrounded by a heavy, unyielding security detail of men whose military posture made it clear they were there to enforce her presence. The images hit social media first, igniting a wildfire of speculation before being picked up by mainstream global outlets within 48 hours. The headlines sent a literal shockwave through the upper tier of American business, confirming that the mysterious woman who had spent 5 years maintaining absolute anonymity while married to the notorious Luca Moretti was, in reality, the sole heir to one of the 10 largest private financial institutions in the country. Sitting in her new executive office on the 42nd floor of Prescott Tower, Evelyn calmly monitored the unfolding media storm, the cold winter light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows and casting long shadows across her desk. She read the sensationalized press coverage without a single flicker of emotion, systematically forwarding 3 specific financial articles to Garrett's public relations team with sharp, handwritten annotations correcting factual distortions regarding her inheritance timeline. She intentionally ignored the hundreds of urgent interview requests and frantic statements flooding her secretary's terminal, knowing that her silence was far more volatile than any curated statement could ever be. The narrative was already doing exactly what she had designed it to do. It was altering the gravity of the market, forcing every banking partner who had ever dismissed her as a mafia underling to realize they had been dealing with a sovereign economic superpower. At exactly 11:47 a.m. on the morning of the 4th day, the first sign of total panic from the Moretti camp arrived at her door. Harrison Voss stepped into her office, his expression perfectly unbothered as he informed her that a high-priority call request had just been submitted by Marcus Webb, Luca Moretti's primary outside counsel. Evelyn didn't even look up from the infrastructure debt documents she was reviewing, her voice dropping to a flat, dismissive whisper as she commanded Harrison to decline the call instantly. Harrison asked what should be done if the attorney persisted, and Evelyn replied that he was to decline it again, and if Luca Moretti ever attempted to bridge the gap directly through any channel. She wanted to be notified immediately, but she explicitly forbade Harrison from letting Luca know she had been informed. Harrison gave a sharp nod of acknowledgement and quietly exited, leaving Evelyn alone with the cold hum of her office. She leaned back in her leather executive chair, her eyes tracking the movement of the clouds over the Manhattan skyline, as she allowed her mind to visualize exactly what Luca was doing at that very second. She knew him with the absolute, terrifying precision of a woman who had spent half a decade studying his rhythms, his silences, and his calculations. She knew that right now, in whatever stark, brick-walled room he was hiding in. He was replaying their entire 5-year marriage like a man trying to decipher a foreign language. He was looking at the luxury hotels, the shell entities, the Delaware registrations, and the offshore investment architectures she had handed him freely, finally understanding where that brilliant, unassailable logic had actually originated. He was realizing that while his arrogant mother and short-sighted capos had been treating her like an expendable nobody, she had been the only entity standing between their syndicate and federal annihilation. Evelyn picked up her heavy executive pen, a cold, liberating peace settling over her mind as she banished the memory of his face from her thoughts. She murmured to herself that you cannot grieve a man who never possessed the capacity to look at you clearly, turning her back completely on the past as she focused entirely on the remaining 2 weeks before the gala. Outside her window, the vast, indifferent machinery of Manhattan continued to grind onward, filled with $1 billion of newly unaligned opportunities. Evelyn Prescott was finally completely visible in the light, and she had an empire to rule. On the evening of the 7th day, the final barrier broke. Luca Moretti stopped trying to hide behind the protective buffer of his high-priced attorneys and sent a direct message himself. He utilized a highly secure, heavily encrypted messaging application that Evelyn had personally configured for their private communication during the very first year of their marriage, a digital channel he had completely ignored for 3 years and that she assumed he had forgotten existed. The notification blinked on her private phone screen, showing 4 short, unadorned words delivered without an ounce of his usual mafia decoration. "We should talk, please." Evelyn picked up the device, her face completely bathed in the cold, gold glow of the Manhattan skyline blazing outside her office window. She read the short message once, set the phone face down on the polished mahogany desk, picked it up a second time to read it again, and then set it down for good. Her heart did not skip a beat. Her hands did not shake. The desperate plea of a fracturing mafia boss was merely white noise to her now. She quietly opened her secure laptop, pulled up the master guest list for the upcoming Winter Legacy Gala, and added one single final name to the roster. She didn't reply to his text, but she sent him his summons. She wanted him in that room. She wanted him to stand there and witness the exact, terrifying dimensions of the sovereign world he had so casually thrown away into the dark. By 9:00 p.m. on the evening of the 11th day, the atmosphere inside the dimly lit corporate library of the Moretti, New York headquarters had become completely unbreathable. Outside, a bitter Manhattan sleet violently pelted the reinforced brick windows. But inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, frantic clacking of a technical keyboard where Dolan, the family's head of cybersecurity, was digging through encrypted archives. Luca Moretti stood perfectly rigid beside the massive oak desk, a glass of dark rye whiskey held loosely in his right hand, his eyes fixed on the glowing monitor with a terrifying, absolute stillness. Across from him sat Marcus Webb, his chief legal counsel, whose face had turned an asymmetric, pale shade of gray over the last 48 hours as the true magnitude of Evelyn S.'s structural departure began to settle into their balance sheets. For 5 years, they had operated under the collective delusion that the quiet, unassuming woman sleeping in Luca's bed was merely a secondary asset, a graceful presence they could easily partition away through a standard, aggressive divorce proceeding. Dolan suddenly stopped typing, his hands freezing above the mechanical keys as a massive, cascading ledger of international shell companies appeared on the screen, illuminating the room in a cold, blue light. He looked up at Luca, his voice dropping to an anxious, gravelly whisper that fractured the heavy silence of the library. He revealed that Evelyn had not simply maintained administrative access to their primary domestic holdings. She had been the sole author and legal architect of their entire offshore diversification strategy. She had systematically embedded a series of highly sophisticated, latent administrative anomalies across 6 separate corporate registries in Delaware and Luxembourg, controlling a hidden infrastructure that routed tens of millions of dollars in legitimate real estate revenue. Luca's jaw tightened, his fingers crushing the edge of his glass as a dark, venomous suspicion flared deep within his chest, demanding to know if she had actively built an internal weapon to sabotage his family from the very beginning of their marriage. Marcus Webb stood up nervously, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand as he pulled up a secondary file containing the compliance history of their primary international banking partner, Meridian Capital. He explained to Luca that these structural anomalies were not an offensive weapon designed to actively destroy them. They were defensive circuit breakers. 2 years ago, when the Federal Regulatory Commission had initiated a sweeping, unannounced audit into their northeastern transit fronts. These exact hidden offshore loops had automatically shielded the family's legitimate hospitality revenues from total seizure, a critical legal detail that the Moretti family's own high-priced legal team had completely overlooked. The revelation hit Luca like a physical blow, forcing him to realize that while his arrogant mother, Vivian, had been treating Evelyn like an expendable parasite, Evelyn had been the quiet, brilliant godmother who kept their entire empire from collapsing into a federal prison cell. Unable to endure the suffocating weight of the uncertainty any longer, Luca pulled his secure satellite phone from his jacket pocket, bypassing his legal channels entirely to open the encrypted communication channel they hadn't used in 3 years. His heart hammered against his ribs with a rare, desperate violence as he typed a direct demand for a meeting, pressing the send button with a hand that was no longer perfectly steady. He expected her to ignore it, or perhaps to forward it to the elite team of Prescott Capital attorneys who had been systematically rejecting Marcus Webb's calls all week. Instead, exactly 7 minutes later, the encrypted application blinked with a single clinical notification, a digital invite containing a formal security pass to the 11th annual Winter Legacy Gala at the Meridian Hotel Ballroom, scheduled for the following Saturday night. When the night of the gala arrived, the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel was an unassailable fortress of American wealth and political dominance, soaring 40 floors above the snow-covered grid of Midtown Manhattan. Enormous crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted, gold leaf ceilings, casting a brilliant, blinding light over a crowd of 230 senators, international banking executives, and corporate defense magnates dressed in tailored tuxedos. Luca Moretti rejected the advice of his remaining capos and entered the grand foyer entirely alone, wearing his finest black three-piece suit, his posture straight and unyielding, despite the immense psychological pressure bearing down on his regime. The entire room seemed to experience a sudden, collective drop in volume as he crossed the threshold. The powerful and the corrupt inside instantly recognized the dangerous aura of the Eastern Seaboard's most feared Mafia Don, their whispers trailing behind him like white noise. Luca completely ignored the elite onlookers, his eyes scanning the vast, glittering expanse of the ballroom until they locked onto an elevated platform at the far northern wall where the Prescott Capital Executive Circle was gathered. Standing in the center of the brilliant light, dressed in a minimalist, deep ivory silk gown that announced absolute sovereignty without a single piece of loud jewelry, was Evelyn Prescott. She stood flanked by her father, the legendary Titan Charles Prescott, and Diana Reese, her head of private intelligence. Her movements fluid and commanding as she navigated conversations with two prominent United States cabinet members. Lucas stopped exactly 12 feet away, his breath catching in his throat as he watched the woman who had spent 5 years quietly folding his laundry and enduring his mother's insults, now command the undisputed rulers of the American financial system with a single, elegant wave of her hand. Suddenly, the house lights smoothly transitioned into a deep, dramatic amber hue, and Charles Prescott stepped up to the primary mahogany podium, his powerful voice echoing through the state-of-the-art audio system with the total authority of a man who owned the building. He officially announced his retirement from the active chairmanship of Prescott Capital, declaring to the global market that the firm's entire $43 billion portfolio would now be commanded exclusively by his sole successor and new chief executive officer, Evelyn Prescott. A thunderous, deafening wave of applause erupted through the ballroom, blinding white camera flashes reflecting off the crystal chandeliers as the global's elite welcomed their new financial queen. Luca stood frozen in the crowd, his pride completely shattered into 1,000 useless pieces as he looked at her resplendent figure. Finally understanding that he hadn't lost an asset or an administrative partner, he had casually thrown away a brilliant, sovereign woman who had chosen to love him freely in the dark. As the formal reception dissolved into smaller networking circles, Evelyn stepped away from the flashing cameras and moved toward the wide glass terrace overlooking the glowing lights of Central Park. her ivory dress cutting a clean path through the crowded ballroom. Luca followed her with a slow, deliberate pace, stepping out into the crisp, freezing winter air where the ambient noise of the party was reduced to a soft, distant hum behind the reinforced glass doors. Evelyn stopped near the marble balustrade, turning her head slightly to acknowledge his presence but maintaining a precise, 2-meter distance between them, the exact calculated spacing his mother had used to humiliate her weeks ago at Tahoe. Luca looked at her face, searching for any residual trace of anger, bitterness, or triumphant vanity, but found only a settled, mature calm that was far more terrifying than any display of hostility. Luca lowered his hands to his sides, gating away every ounce of his mafia armor as he delivered the first sincere, unmanaged apology of his entire adult life. His voice steady but thick with a profound, internal grief. He stated flatly that he was not apologizing because his empire was fracturing or because his banking partners were fleeing. He was apologizing for how the marriage had ended. He looked her dead in the eye and confessed that he had spent 5 years looking at her role within his organization, but had completely stopped looking at her as a living human being. Evelyn absorbed his words with a faint, bittersweet smile that carried no hatred, her dark eyes reflecting the vast, indifferent expanse of the New York skyline behind him as she accepted the closure he was offering. She told him gently to go deal with his internal coalition, commanding him to hold the Moretti organization together, because that was the brutal, necessary world he had been built to navigate, and she explicitly forbade him from letting his regime fall apart on her account. She turned her back on him with a graceful, definitive sweep of her ivory gown, stepping back through the glass doors to merge effortlessly with the sea of billionaires and dignitaries who eagerly awaited her command. Luca stood entirely alone on the freezing terraces for a long time, watching her through the glass as she reclaimed her true kingdom, finally realizing that the greatest tragedy of his life was not that she had kept her identity a secret, but that he had been too blind to see the empire standing right in front of him. Thank you for staying until the very last word. It genuinely means everything. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and if this story stayed with you. You know what to do. More stories like this one are coming. The cold winter light of a Tuesday morning cut sharply through the heavy, armored glass windows of the 42nd floor of Prescott Tower, casting long, geometric shadows across the pristine expanse of Evelyn Prescott's new executive desk. Outside, the vast and indifferent machinery of Manhattan ground forward in the crisp air, a bustling grid of opportunity that seemed to move in perfect, silent alignment with the cold resolve settling deep within her chest. Evelyn sat perfectly rigid in her leather executive chair, her dark hair pulled back into a flawless, unyielding knot that mirrored the absolute clinical sharpness of her mind. She had spent the last 72 hours completely detached from the emotional residue of her past life, treating the collapse of her 5-year marriage to Luca Moretti not as a personal tragedy, but as a solved corporate equation whose variables had finally shifted back into her favor. On the desk before her lay a series of newly minted financial dossiers, their crisp white pages detailing the immediate macroeconomic fallout generated by her sudden, spectacular re-entry into the upper tier of American finance. She picked up a heavy, engraved fountain pen, her movements slow and deliberate as she began reviewing the tactical reports compiled by her father's private intelligence team. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the heavy mahogany door to her office clicked open with a quiet, synchronized precision, and Harrison Voss stepped onto the plush carpet. He moved with the unhurried, ghostly efficiency of a man who had spent 22 years managing the absolute sovereignty of the Prescott family, a secure crimson folder held tightly under his arm. He stopped precisely 3 feet from the edge of her desk, his stone-carved expression completely devoid of emotional annotation as he looked down at the new chief executive officer. Without an ounce of introductory preamble, Harrison stated flatly that a high-priority call request had just been submitted to their primary routing switchboard by Marcus Webb, Luca Moretti's outside general counsel. He explained that the attorney was calling from a verified encryption line in New York, and that the urgency of the request indicated the Moretti syndicate had finally completed their internal arithmetic regarding her true net worth. Evelyn did not flinch, nor did her eyes deviate from the infrastructure debt documents she was annotating. She simply let the silence stretch for 3 precise seconds before murmuring a single, flat directive. Decline. Harrison nodded once, his pen hovering over his ledger as he asked what should be done if the attorney persisted. Evelyn turned a page, her voice dropping to a cool, lethal whisper as she commanded him to decline it again, adding that if Luca Moretti ever attempted to bridge the gap directly through any channel, she wanted to be notified instantly, but she explicitly forbade Harrison from letting Luca know she had been informed. The directive was executed with the flawless, clockwork efficiency that defined the Prescott universe, leaving Evelyn alone once more with the quiet hum of her 42nd floor empire. She set her pen down on the polished wood, leaning back slowly in her chair as her mind automatically visualized the exact dimensions of the panic current rippling through the Moretti headquarters. She knew with the absolute, terrifying precision of a woman who had spent half a decade studying Lucas rhythms that he was likely standing in his stark, brick-walled office, staring at the financial press with a hack expression. He would be replaying their entire 5-year marriage, like a man trying to read a foreign blueprint in the dark, forced to realize that the quiet, unassuming woman his family had treated like dirt was, in reality, the sole architect of their legitimacy. He would be looking at the luxury hotels in 4 international cities, the Delaware real estate funds, and the complex private equity structures she had handed him freely, finally understanding where that brilliant, unassailable logic had actually originated. Evelyn felt a profound, liberating peace settle over her thoughts, murmuring to herself that you cannot grieve a man who never possessed the capacity to look at you clearly, turning her back completely on the past as she focused entirely on the remaining days before the gala. Meanwhile, 3 miles uptown, inside the reinforced third-floor office of the Moretti New York compound, the atmosphere had become completely toxic. Luca Moretti stood perfectly still near the window that faced a blank brick wall, a half-empty cup of black coffee going entirely cold in his right hand. He had not slept more than 3 hours in the past 4 days, and the toll of the exhaustion was etched deeply into the rigid set of his broad shoulders and the desperate, controlled quality of his immobility. The room around him was utterly devoid of performance or art, holding only a secure telephone line, a heavy desk, and the thick crimson folder that Marcus Webb had slammed down minutes ago. The attorney sat in the leather chair across from the desk, his tie completely loosened, his breathing shallow as he watched his boss process the finality of the disaster. Marcus stated with a harsh, professional bluntness that their due diligence team had committed a catastrophic, historic error. He revealed that Evelyn Prescott had never legally changed her last name to Moretti on any corporate or civil registry. She had socialized under his name, but her legal identity had remained fully attached to Prescott Capital throughout the entirety of their marriage. Luca did not smash the glass in his hand, nor did he raise his voice. When the Lord of the Eastern Seaboard lost control, his atmosphere went somewhere quiet, cold, and profoundly terrifying. He set the cold coffee cup onto the narrow windowsill, walked to the desk with a mechanical, measured stride, and opened the financial summary. His eyes locked onto a family photograph taken 8 years ago, showing Charles Prescott standing beside Evelyn at an elite private function, her posture already carrying that exact unconstructed authority Luca had spent 5 years watching without ever naming. He did the rapid internal arithmetic, his voice completely flat as he forced Marcus to confirm the asset valuation of Prescott Capital. Marcus cleared his throat nervously, stating that the fund had $43 billion under active management, according to the latest conservative private assessments, controlling key sovereign debt positions across 6 continents. Luca closed the folder with a slow, heavy thud, the realization dawning on him like a physical suffocation that his wife was the sole heir to one of the largest private financial juggernauts in the United States, and she had built his empire using her own world's blueprints without ever revealing whose daughter she was. The silence that followed inside the mafia office was absolute. A vacuum where the last possible innocent explanation had just died and taken all the air with it. Luca turned back to the window, his mind violently replaying a high-profile dinner in Washington 3 years ago, with 2 powerful United States senators and a deputy secretary. He remembered how Evelyn had managed the entire table with a flawless, surgical precision, guiding the legislation to benefit Moretti transit lines without anyone ever feeling manipulated. He had been proud of her that night, telling her so in the back of the car, assuming her faint smile was a reflection of her pleasure. He understood now, with a bitter and sickening clarity, that she wasn't pleased. She was patient, She had been protecting him from walking into a room where her father sat, protecting the marriage from an explosion before she was ready. Luca gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning a stark white as he looked at the messaging application on his phone, staring at the 4 unadorned words he had sent her 4 days ago. "We should talk. Please." There was no reply, only a gold silence that signaled she had already moved her pieces across the board, leaving him stranded in a territory he no longer controlled. The tectonic plates of the eastern seaboard's underworld shifted violently at precisely 2:17 in the morning when the first formal institutional defection materialized on Luca Moretti as secure terminal. The call did not come from an aggressive prosecutor or an ambitious rival syndicate, but from Caruso, the longest-serving capo and head of Eastern operations, whose voice carried the specific, deadpan flatness of an experienced commander delivering a fatal casualty report. Standing in the center of his New York office under the pale, clinical glare of a single desk lamp, Luca listened as Caruso confirmed that Meridian Capital Partners had officially severed their 11-year relationship with the Moretti Syndicate. Meridian was not merely their largest banking resource. It was the historical bridge that Evelyn had inherited and meticulously restructured. The original gateway that allowed their cash flows to transition into the legitimate sunlight of Wall Street finance. Luca set his jaw, his eyes fixed on the blank brick wall outside his window, as Caruso added that Carver Group was currently convening an emergency compliance review, a corporate euphemism that Webb knew meant they were already drafting the paperwork to freeze their remaining credit lines. The structural hemorrhage worsened exponentially before dawn when Marco Altieri, the absolute sovereign of the second largest crime family on the coast and the Moretti regime's most critical peer ally, bypassed standard diplomatic protocols to contact Caruso directly instead of the boss. Altieri's message was stripped of any fraternal decoration. He had read the financial press. His internal strategist had done the arithmetic on Prescott Capital's retaliatory capability, and he was officially calling an emergency summit of all Eastern Seaboard families to re-examine the coalition's leadership architecture. Luca absorbed the data with a frozen, terrifying immobility, realizing with total clarity that in the world of organized leverage, when your allies see you make an executive error of this magnitude, they do not see an understandable domestic dispute. They see systemic weakness. He commanded Caruso to schedule a mandatory House meeting at the New York compound for exactly 7:00 p.m. that evening, instructing him to assemble every capo, logistics director, and asset manager within the organization, before hanging up without a single word of personal frustration. At exactly 3:00 in the afternoon, the heavy mahogany doors of his office slid open to admit Vivian Moretti, who arrived dressed in a flawless, structured charcoal suit with her silver hair perfectly coiffed, carrying the unbothered serenity of a matriarch who believed she had executed a necessary domestic cleansing. Luca did not rise from his seat, nor did he offer her the traditional courtly respect she had demanded for 3 decades. He simply stood near the windowsill with his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze cutting through her composure like a razor. He asked her flatly if she had conducted a deep background check on Evelyn before authorizing the Tahoe execution, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic whisper that immediately made the air in the room turn heavy. Vivian's chin came up defensively as she reminded him that he had personally bypassed the due diligence process 5 years ago because he was 31 and arrogant, leaving her team to perform only a surface-level financial review that never flagged the Prescott lineage, because Evelyn had intentionally scrubbed her public digital footprint. Luca took 2 measured steps toward her, his presence casting a long, menacing shadow over her armchair as he told her with absolute, clinical venom that her short-sighted Kiu had single-handedly destroyed their institutional foundation. He stated that while she was busy treating his wife like expendable dirt to preserve some imagined aristocratic purity, Evelyn was quietly operating as the sole legal shield, preventing the federal government from dismantling their entire hospitality network. He informed his mother that the financial press was currently treating the Moretti name as an international joke, a minor regional syndicate that had accidentally discarded the sole heir to a $43 billion Wall Street empire because they lacked the intelligence to read their own balance sheets. Vivian's architectural composure finally experienced a microscopic, involuntary tremor, her lips tightening as she quietly admitted it looked like a catastrophic miscalculation. Before Luca commanded her to get out of his sight, turning his back on her as she reconstructed her dignity and exited the room in silence. By 7:12 p.m., the grand conference room on the ground floor of the compound was packed to capacity with 14 stone-faced men whose collective expressions mirrored the grim, atmospheric pressure of a sinking ship. Luca walked in late, a strategic deviation he never permitted, and took his place at the head of the long table, staring down the line of his capos, logistics heads, and panicked financial advisors who were all clutching newly updated portfolio summaries. He placed his heavy hands flat against the polished oak surface, looked every man dead in the eye, and admitted with absolute, brutal honesty that he had been completely blind to Evelyn's true identity until 4 days ago. He stated that he would not tolerate a single second of internal panic or corporate infighting, declaring that while the Prescott name now commanded the banking pipeline, the physical registrations, Delaware shell structures, and hospitality entities remained legally under Moretti control. Caruso leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table as he asked the definitive question: if their international credit lines were strong enough to survive a direct, coordinated freeze from Prescott Capital's banking network over the next 2 weeks. Luca looked back at his oldest capo and answered with an unblinking, chilling calm that he didn't know yet, but he commanded them to freeze all asset migrations, halt all offshore liquidations, and maintain an absolute performance of corporate stability before the Altieri summit convened. He declared that whatever occurred between him and Evelyn Prescott was a strictly personal debt, and that the Moretti organization would continue to hold its positions with teeth bared, because an empire that panics is an empire that invites its own execution. The men nodded in a silent, instinctual submission to his authority, the meeting dissolving in exactly 20 minutes as Luca remained seated alone in the empty, echoing room, listening to the bitter winter rain hammer against the glass like a countdown he had no power to stop. The heavy, unmanaged silence that filled the grand conference room of the Moretti, New York headquarters after the capos filed out was a physical weight pressing against the back of Luca Moretti's neck. He sat completely motionless at the head of the empty table, his eyes fixed on the illuminated screen of his phone, where a newly arrived news alert flashed with a cold, mocking brilliance. The headline confirmed that Prescott Capital sources had officially verified Evelyn Prescott's immediate return to an active, sovereign executive role within her family's multi-billion-dollar firm. The brief report noted that the upcoming Winter Legacy Gala was universally expected to serve as her formal public coronation as the undisputed chairman and chief executive officers of the empire. Luca read the words twice, his face hardening into an expression of profound, hawk-hack exhaustion as he set the device face down on the polished wood. He knew the gala intimately. Everyone in the relevant social, political, and financial geography of New York understood its immense, systemic gravity. It was a room populated exclusively by the 230 individuals who mattered in every single way that money, leverage, and raw power measured mattering. A bitter, sickening realization washed over Luca as he stared at the dark back of his phone, remembering how he had received formal invitations to that exact gala in previous years, all of which had been quietly and precisely declined. He had foolishly assumed back then that Evelyn was simply avoiding the vapid vanity of high society charity events. But he understood now, with absolute clarity, that she had been protecting him. She had been deliberately shielding their marriage, keeping him from walking blindly into a room where her father sat, preventing a premature structural collision before she was ready to decide what her life would look like on the other side. She had given him 5 years of her mind, her loyalty, and her administrative genius. And his family had rewarded that devotion by treating her like expendable dirt in a public theater. Luca put his hawk-hawk face in his hands for a single, unmanaged moment, letting the full weight of his own blindness crush his pride before he straightened his spine and dialed Marcus Webb's private line. He commanded his chief counsel to find a legal, political, or charitable loophole to get his name on that gala guest list immediately, declaring that he would not stand outside in the dark while Evelyn constructed the master narrative of their split without his response in the room. Following morning, the answer to his desperate maneuver arrived at the Moretti compound, but it didn't come through any of the back-channel political fixers or banking contacts Marcus Webb had spent the night harassing. It arrived on a silver tray in the grand entrance hall, contained within a plane, heavy cream-colored envelope that bore Luca's name written in a sharp, elegant cursive script he recognized with an instinctual jolt. It was Evelyn S. handwriting, the particular, unyielding slant of her letters, the heavy pressure she always applied to consonants, and the single, clean stroke with which she crossed her TS without a single fraction of a waver. There was no personal note enclosed, no message of anger, and no hint of emotional reconciliation. There was only the formal, embossed security pass to the Winter Legacy Gala. Luca held the heavy cardstock in his hand, feeling its weight settle into his palm like a literal summons to an execution. He understood with a cold, chilling certainty that this was not a gesture of forgiveness or a sign that her posture had softened. This was an executive command. She had chosen to send it to him directly in her own hand because she wanted him in that room to witness the exact, terrifying dimensions of the sovereign world he had so casually thrown away into the dark. Luca walked slowly back up the stairs toward his private office, his fingers tightly gripping the cream envelope, his mechanical strides carrying the rigid precision of a man keeping his body functional through sheer willpower. He closed the door, locking himself away from the anxious stares of his remaining security details, and stood alone in the center of the stark room to face the data Dolan S. Sweeps had uncovered. On the corner of his desk lay the updated access logs detailing every single digital file, domestic, corporate, front, an international shell registry Evelyn had touched or modified over the last 2 years of their marriage. Luca picked up the legal pad, his eyes tracking the cold, architectural precision of her maneuvers as he read through Dolan's technical annotations line by line. She hadn't just maintained administrative control over their legitimate hospitality revenue. She had systematically embedded a series of highly sophisticated, latent clause anomalies across 6 separate corporate frameworks. A dark, venomous tension rippled through Luca's chest as his mind automatically analyzed the revenue distribution schedules under page 3's real estate transactions. Every single anomaly was structured into standard boilerplate arbitration language, designed to redirect millions of dollars in surplus profit to a secure holding entity registered under a front address on Park Avenue, the exact location of Charles Prescott's private residence. For 2 long years, while he was expanding his operations and believing his empire was growing on a foundation he fully understood, a slow, patient architectural bleeding had been installed in his structures by the very woman who designed them. The horror of the betrayal was not simple. It didn't reduce cleanly to a villain and a victim, because Luca knew with an absolute, agonizing certainty that this woman had loved him with everything she possessed. She had watched his back, shielded his money, and run information back to the one financial juggernaut capable of dismantling his entire existence. And he couldn't determine which reading of the evidence was true without asking her directly, desperate to bridge the chasm before the gala sealed their fates. Luca used Marcus Webb to track down Sonia Reyes, a personal assistant who had maintained a quiet, entirely private friendship with Evelyn after leaving the Syndicate S employment. Sonia placed the high-risk call to Evelyn S. private line at exactly 9:45 p.m., speaking to her for 4 brief minutes before patching the connection through to a clean, unmonitored line Marcus had established in the Moretti office. Luca was sitting alone in the darkness when the terminal rang, picking up the receiver before the second ring could finish, his breathing shallow as a heavy, static-filled silence stretched across the digital line. Then her voice arrived calm, clipped and completely level, informing him with a devastating clinical sharpness that he had exactly 10 minutes to say whatever his position required him to say. Luca had spent 40 minutes preparing for this exact moment, organizing his legal arguments, his counter leverages, and his defensive talking points. But the sheer gravity of her presence stripped away his armor, leaving him to ask a raw, animal question. "Did you build it against me?" A long, suffocating silence followed before Evelyn replied, her voice remaining perfectly flat, refusing to heat up or defend itself against his accusation. She asked him calmly which truth his pride required, the one where she answered his immediate question, or the one where she explained the catastrophic errors his own legal team had missed. She stated with absolute certainty that the structures were entirely protective, not offensive. The value redirections were circuit breakers designed to automatically extract his hospitality assets from high-risk domestic jurisdictions before federal regulatory commissions could freeze them. She revealed that his legal filings in Delaware alone contained an administrative error that would have cost him his entire legitimate operation within 3 months if her father Fest's compliance team hadn't caught and quietly corrected it in 3 days. Luca lists to the flawless, unassailable logic of her delivery, tracking the rhythm he had traveled through daily for 5 years, realizing with a sickening blow that she wasn't lying. She had used her family's massive corporate intelligence resources to clean up the messes his own capos were making, going around him because she knew his arrogance would turn a structural problem into an emotional battleground. The weight of her words settled into the dark office like a physical suffocation, forcing Luca to look down at her turned-over photograph on his desk, feeling the absolute paralyzing sensation of realizing that the person he was furious at was completely right. He whispered her name into the receiver, his voice cracking with a sudden, unmanaged grief. But Evelyn cut through the weakness, stating flatly that his 10 minutes were up and that she would not negotiate the terms of her future with him. She told him with a calm, definitive, clear certainty that went deeper than any mafia cruelty that he had spent 5 years enjoying her mind without ever once bothering to ask who she was before him, and that it was now far too late to start asking. The line went dead with a soft click, leaving Luca with a cold, useless telephone in his hand just as Caruso burst into the room without knocking. His face twisted into an expression of raw, unmanaged panic as he announced that Marco Altieri was not waiting for their 2-week deadline. He had officially called a mandatory summit of all crime families for the exact same night as the Prescott Gala. Luca slowly set the dead phone down, his eyes narrowing into a lethal focus as he stood up and commanded Caruso to summon the couples back to the conference room, declaring that the summit could happen without them because he refused to let Altieri choose the ground. And he refused to be absent from the room where Evelyn Prescott finally stepped into the light. Thank you for staying until the very last word. It genuinely means everything. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. More stories like this one are coming. The 3 days leading up to the event passed with the exact, unyielding texture of the hours before a high-speed highway collision time, moving neither slowly nor quickly, but carrying the heavy weight of an impending structural impact that nothing on earth could pull back. Inside the Moretti, New York headquarters, the systemic bleeding of their corporate infrastructure continued without a single moment of operational relief, as 2 additional international banking relationships finalized their formal, panic-driven withdrawal from the Syndicate S credit line. Marco Altieri's mandatory Underworld Summit had officially convened in a fortified location downtown without Luca Moretti's presence, and the heavily guarded intelligence reports, slipping back-through-back channels, were being kept deliberately vague, a chilling indication that definitive decisions regarding the reclassification of the Moretti territory had already been made but not yet committed to paper. Despite the suffocating atmospheric pressure enclosing his regime, Luca stood perfectly motionless in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his private dressing room on the afternoon of the gala, his face an unbending mask of absolute executive focus. He was wearing the heavy, midnight black 3-piece suit, not the dark navy one Evelyn had selected for him in Milan, but the specific, historic garment he reserved exclusively for his father's funeral, and the 3 critical operations that had previously redefined the entire trajectory of his life. He wore it when the situation demanded him to be the most lethal, exact version of himself, a man who had built something immense and broken something realer, and who was now walking directly into a crowded theater to face the absolute consequence of his own blindness. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, soaring 40 floors above the snow-dusted concrete grid of Midtown Manhattan, was an unassailable temple of American wealth, political dominance, and social prestige. Massive crystal chandeliers the size of luxury vehicles hung from the vaulted, gold-leaf ceilings, casting a brilliant, blinding light over a crowd of 230 senators, oil magnates, and foreign dignitaries whose tailored attire communicated their absolute ownership of the financial system. It was a ruthless, sophisticated ecosystem where a single whispered conversation near the bar could quietly migrate millions of dollars across international registries or permanently execute a political career that had taken 3 decades to construct. Luca Moretti stepped through the towering mahogany entrance of the ballroom, with Caruso flanking his left and Dolan positioned exactly 3 steps behind, his mechanical strides carrying the heavy, chilling aura of the Coast's most feared mafia don. He had navigated hostile territory his entire adult life. Yet, as he felt the immediate, physical shift in the room's atmosphere, a rare and hollow sensation of absolute exposure settled deep within his chest. Every face in the crowded ballroom was already pointed in a single, unyielding direction toward the center of the floor. They're careful, measuring attention, completely ignoring the entrance of the syndicate, because their focus was locked onto the coronation of a new economic superpower. Evelyn Prescott stood near the elevated platform beside her father, her resplendent figure stopping the breath in Luca's throat with a physical abruptness that stripped away his remaining defensive calculations. She was wearing a gown of deep, architectural ivory silk, a minimalist masterpiece that required a woman of immense internal authority to wear it rather than be worn by its design. Her dark hair was styled up in a flawless, unyielding knot, making the clean line of her neck and shoulders carry that exact unconstructed posture Luca had spent 5 years watching without ever possessing the intelligence to name. He could name it now, standing 40 feet away with 200 billionaires between them. It was the unmistakable posture of a sovereign individual who had entirely stopped performing for an audience and had started simply being. This was the magnificent, lethal reality of the woman he had spent half a decade attempting to hold smaller within his brick-walled prison. Beside her stood Charles Prescott, his broad, iron-like shoulders casting a literal shadow of absolute financial authority over a prominent United States senator who was currently leaning toward the old titan with the desperate, calculated deference of a man who had recently recalibrated who in this room required his submission. Luca accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server's tray, refusing to drink a single drop but holding the crystal stem simply to give his heavy fingers an executive task while he navigated the measuring stares of the crowd. He moved through the glittering expanse slowly, exchanging the mandatory, cold greetings required by his position, tracking Evelyn's location by pure instinct, while feeling his own irrelevance intensify with every step. Suddenly, the unbothered figure of Diana Reese materialized at his left elbow, a small glass of mineral water held loosely in her hand, her stone-carved features completely devoid of emotional annotation, without a single shred of introductory preamble. The head of Prescott Capital's Private Intelligence Division stated flatly that Evelyn was fully aware of his presence, before delivering a final tactical revelation that completely destroyed the remaining narrative Luca had built to shield his pride. Diana revealed that during her very last night inside the Lake Tahoe estate, while the family was celebrating his betrayal, Evelyn had spent her final hours transferring the complete corporate correction protocols directly onto the Moretti organization's internal servers. The secure file contained every decryption key, administrative pass, and legal amendment required to safely sever their Luxembourg connections and rectify the Delaware K. Hofop Lee entirely within the week. Luca stood perfectly paralyzed in the center of the ballroom as Diana S-flat. Professional voice cut through the ambient hum of the string quartet, explaining that the structural anomalies were never an offensive weapon designed to actively destroy his family. They were merely insurance, a sophisticated circuit breaker she had built to protect his assets from federal seizure, an unyielding lever of total leverage that she had possessed the absolute power to pull at any second during their marriage, but had chosen never to activate because she loved him. Diana looked across the room briefly, her whisper carrying a chilling historical venom as she stated that Evelyn had spent 5 long years building an empire for Mafia Dawn without a single layer of protection for herself, and had merely wanted one secure barrier she could hold if her freedom was ever cornered. The intelligence director vanished back into the crowded elite before Luca could formulate a single response, leaving the boss standing entirely hollowed out as the last false version of his story collapsed into dust. She had protected him until the very last second, even while his family was treating her like dirt, and he had destroyed the entire marriage simply to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of being seen clearly by a woman with clear eyes. The house lights suddenly transitioned into a deep, dramatic amber, and Charles Prescott stepped up to the primary mahogany microphone at the front of the ballroom, causing the music to fade as the global elite oriented themselves towards the small raised platform. The old titan did not perform. He spoke with the flat, unassailable confidence of a master engineer reporting on structural dimensions. stating that 51 years ago he had founded Prescott Capital with $40,000 and the useful certainty that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. A warm, respectful murmur rippled through the room as Charles paused, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the senators and CEOs before turning slightly to look at his daughter with a private, unblinking pride that required no validation from the audience. He officially announced to the global market that Evelyn Prescott had agreed to assume full, undisputed leadership of Prescott Capital, declaring that effective the first of the year. She would serve as both chairman and chief executive officer, the first individual in the firm's history to hold both sovereign titles simultaneously. The ballroom exploded into a thunderous, deafening wave of genuine applause. Blinding white digital camera flashes reflecting off the crystal chandeliers as the rulers of American finance welcomed their new queen. Evelyn did not offer the crowd a performance version of a smile. She briefly pressed her lips together, lifted her chin with an unyielding regal authority, and looked at the room with the directness of a person who had completely stopped hiding her light from the world. Luca stood 12 feet away, watching her coronation in real time, feeling the absolute, crushing weight of everything he had wasted land on his shoulders all at once. It was not the loss of her $43 billion fund, the political access, or the unassailable credit lines that broke his spirit. It was the realization that for 5 years, this magnificent sovereign woman had chosen him freely, spending her genius on his empire, not because she required his protection, but because she believed he was a man worth loving. He had been terrified of that exact Thohio, terrified of being known by someone who saw past his mafia title, and he had allowed his family to reduce her to nothing, simply to retreat back into the safe, superficial control of his blank brick walls. As the crowd shifted into smaller celebratory circles, Evelyn smoothly navigated the congratulations of the cabinet members, her movements carrying the natural, unconstructed ease of a leader who had found her footing on her own ground. Then she stopped moving, turned her head, and looked directly into Luca's eyes for the very first time since he had arrived in the ballroom. The distance between them was exactly 8 feet. A heavy, static-filled vacuum extending between their postures as neither of them moved for a single, breathless moment. Evelyn said a brief word to the dignitary beside her and walked straight toward him, her ivory silk gown cutting a clean path through the elite onlookers. Luca made himself stand perfectly still, forcing his breathing to remain slow and regulated, refusing to interpret her approach as anything more than the execution of a final executive decree. She stopped exactly 2 feet away, the precise, calculated distance his mother Vivian had used to deliver her insults at Lake Tahoe, and looked up at his face with that unreadable, deep expression he had spent half a decade trying to decipher and always slightly missing. Around them, the sprawling ballroom of the Meridian Hotel continued to hum with the quiet transactions of America's financial elite, a vibrant sea of diamonds and low conversation that felt entirely distinct from the sudden, hespy stillness that anchored the 2 feet of space between Evelyn Prescott and Luca Moretti. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the indifferent Manhattan night pressed hard against the room, casting the cold reflection of the city's glowing skyscrapers onto the polished marble below. Evelyn stood perfectly still, her minimalist deep ivory silk gown catching the sharp, brilliant glare of the crystal chandeliers, her posture holding that flawless, unconstructed sovereignty that no longer required an audience to be real. Luca made himself breathe, his midnight black suit feeling like a rigid cage for his pride as he looked at her face with an absolute, hawk-hack intensity, desperately trying to memorize the sharp, clear line of her features. The distance between them was the exact, calculated boundary his mother Vivian had used to execute her domestic exile at Lake Tahoe, a bitter and poetic irony that neither of them noted out loud, but that both understood completely. Luca lowered his gaze briefly to the floor before forcing his eyes back to meet her unblinking, dark stare, completely striping away the protective armor of his mafia title for the very first time in his adult life. He stated with a quiet, Gan-Tung-Chu gravity that he owed her an apology, clarifying immediately that he was not apologizing because his corporate infrastructure was bleeding out, or because his international banking partners were thou-chait. He was apologizing for how the marriage had ended, and specifically for the cruel public theater he had permitted his family to construct at the Lake Tahoe estate. Luca took a slow, painful breath, his voice dropping to a raw, deeply honest whisper as he confessed that for 5 long years, He had been entirely blind to her reality. He admitted that he had spent their entire marriage looking strictly at her administrative role within his organization and his family, treating her genius as an invisible utility, while completely failing to look at the living connuee standing right in front of him. Something microscopic shifted across Evelyn S. face, not a softening of her defensive lines, but a sudden, intense presence. The unmistakable look of a brilliant person who had been underestimated for a lifetime, finally hearing themselves accurately assessed. The accurate recognition produced a quiet ripple in her composure that was not quite pain and not quite relief, but a bittersweet intersection of both emotions. She told him quietly that his mother Vivian had made a conscious choice at Tahoe, but that he had made a definitive choice not to stop her, stating flatly that those were two entirely different structural failures. Luca nodded once, his jaw tightening, as he admitted that she was completely right, repeating the confirmation a second time to ensure the truth carried its proper weight in the room. He stated that he possessed no acceptable version of the past where his neglect was justified. He simply had to live with the hoi-tiek of understanding her value when the knowing was already too late to be useful. Evelyn looked out at the glowing Central Park grid through the glass terrace doors, her voice remaining perfectly flat and even, though the effort it cost her to maintain that clinical rhythm was visible in the tight set of her jaw. She brought up the encrypted files she had left behind on his secure servers, confirming that she had never intended to use the structural anomalies to actively damage his family's hospitality fronts. Luca replied that he knew the truth now, stating that in 5 years, even when the communication between them had turned ice cold, she had never played a single hand to destroy, but had always played to build. He added that the Luxembourg loop was genuinely accidental because a master architect of her caliber would have selected a far cleaner, more lethal instrument if sabotage had been her objective. Evelyn's dark eyes locked back onto his with an unyielding clarity, asking him flatly what his position actually wanted from her tonight. Luca discarded the strategic, calibrated answers he had spent 40 minutes organizing, telling her honestly that he had simply wanted to see her in this room, to witness what she looked like when she wasn't forcing herself to hold smaller for someone else's fragile ego. He stated that he wanted to deliver his apology out loud in a theater that was watching, even if the elite crowd was currently occupied with their own corporate transactions, because her dignity deserved that public validation. Evelyn stayed quiet for a long moment, a settled, adult grief filling the space between them, the quiet, heavy mourning of a person who had completely moved through a tragedy and was now looking at the empty space where the love used to live. She told him softly that she had loved him in the beginning because he was the first individual who had ever made her feel like her mind was the most critical thing about her, long before the Prescott name or the $43 billion inheritance interfered. She revealed that he had asked her questions nobody had ever bothered to ask, but that the moment he secured his empire, he had simply stopped being curious about her. She stated that she had stayed for years, quietly constructing his Delaware fronts and cleaning his compliance errors, hoping he would start looking again, but that she had ultimately built his entire kingdom while he was still staring blankly at a brick wall. Luca had absolutely nothing adequate to offer for that truth. The structural damage of his neglect was undeniable. Evelyn reached out, her fingers briefly grazing the edge of her champagne glass as she thanked him for coming to the Winter Legacy Gala tonight. She stated calmly that she had explicitly intended for him to be in this ballroom, not as a malicious punishment, but as an absolute demonstration of the truth. She needed him to understand the exact, terrifying dimensions of the sovereign world he was leaving behind when he casually let her walk out of his gates at Tahoe. Luca looked at her face with the deep, respectful attention he should have been utilizing for 5 years, telling her quietly that his love for her had been real, regardless of the system's failure. Evelyn gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement, stating simply that she knew it was real, and that its reality was the exact thing that had made the marriage worth grieving. She held his gaze for one final, breathless second before her expression smoothly transitioned into the polished, unyielding mask of the Prescott Capital chairman. She commanded him to go deal with Marco Altieri's Underworld Summit and to hold his family's organization together, stating flatly that his focus was built for that brutal environment and forbidding him from letting his infrastructure collapse on her account. Luca straightened his spine against the cold air of the terrace, answering firmly that it wouldn't fall apart. especially not because of her. Evelyn almost smiled a brief, 2-second flicker of genuine warmth that marked the absolute conclusion of their history before she turned her back on him with a graceful, definitive sweep of her deep ivory silk gown. She said a final goodbye and walked straight back into the ruck-row light of the ballroom, her shoulders back, her head level, moving with an unhurried regal authority toward a group of international banking partners. Within 15 seconds, the brilliant figure of Evelyn Prescott was completely absorbed into the high society crowd, her face shifting effortlessly into the public version of its executive majesty as she accepted the courtly greetings of the elite. Luca stood completely alone in the center of the Winter Legacy Gala for another 5 minutes, watching her navigate the room until her ivory dress was no longer visually distinct from the glittering sea of billionaires. Then, he adjusted the cuffs of his black jacket, turned to exit, and walked out through the heavy mahogany doors. He moved down the long corridor to the elevator bank, descending 40 floors in absolute vacuum-like silence before exiting into the freezing Manhattan night, where his armored cars were waiting with their engines running. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, his phone buzzed violently with an urgent call from Caruso, confirming that the Altieri summit had concluded 2 hours ago and that the alliance structure was under formal review. Luca looked out the rain-streaked window at the blurring neon lights of the city, his voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp whisper as he commanded Caruso to establish a direct line with Marco Altieri tonight, declaring that the time for hiding behind attorneys was finished and that they were going to implement Evelyn's correction protocols across every single Morady asset, whatever the structural cost. 3 weeks after the stunning revelations of the Winter Legacy Gala, the manicured concrete plaza outside Prescott Tower was swallowed by a relentless, bone-chilling December downpour. The sky over Manhattan had been a stubborn, heavy gray for 5 consecutive days, and tonight the rain came down cold and direct, washing over the city streets without an ounce of theatrical drama or apology. Luca Moretti stood entirely alone on the slick sidewalk, his broad shoulders squared against the elements, refusing the protection of an umbrella or the traditional security detail that usually tracked his every movement. He had told Dolan he needed exactly 1 hour of isolation, and his loyal security chief, recognizing the unyielding finality in his boss's voice, had simply nodded and parked the armored vehicle at the far end of the block. The freezing water soaked steadily through the heavy wool of Luca's black coat, but he did not flinch or move away from the perimeter of the glass skyscraper. He was not there to force his way inside, nor was he there to beg for a secondary negotiation or demand an artificial ending that he could control. Over the last 21 days, those desperate impulses had fractured his thoughts, but he had calmly dissected and discarded each of them. He was here simply to stand as himself, stripped of his mafia armor, to look up at the glowing tower and absorb the absolute weight of the magnificent life he had failed to live. Behind the towering glass facade, the grand lobby of Prescott Tower was bathed in a warm, steady, and unassailable light that seemed to radiate from deep within the building's architectural core. Luca watched the sharp, military movements of the 2 security specialists staffing the dark marble desk, his eyes tracing the elevator banks that shot upward into the darkness. 42 floors above the sleeping grid of Manhattan, Evelyn Prescott sat in her executive suite, effortlessly executing the brilliant, sovereign financial strategy she had been born to command. For 5 long years, she had deployed that exact masterclass logic to clean up the systemic compliance errors of the Moretti organization, protecting his family's assets while he remained utterly blind to her light. Luca pulled his private phone from his wet pocket and opened the secure messaging application, the digital relic from the first year of their marriage that he had once foolishly assumed was forgotten. The last line in the encrypted thread was his own desperate plea from weeks ago, an unresolved text that had been met with a devastating, total silence, with steady, deliberate fingers. Luca began to type a new message, his words stripped of any tactical deception or demand for leverage. The bitter rain smeared the glass display, making the characters difficult to track. But he did not rush the delivery. He wrote that he finally understood what he had possessed, and exactly what his arrogance had done to ruin it. He stated flatly that he was not asking for an audience or an exceptional concession. He simply required her to know that he saw her clearly now, all of it. He closed the message with a quiet, unconditional apology, hitting the send button not as a corporate transaction to salvage his infrastructure, but purely as the unadorned truth. He stood motionless for another long minute as a yellow cab slid past the curb and a young couple under a shared umbrella hurried down the avenue. The indifferent city moving onward without pausing for his grief. Then, a sudden vibration rippled through his palm. The screen illuminated, displaying her name above a single, unyielding line of text. I know. Take care of yourself, Luca. Luca read the brief benediction once, a slow, deep breath of the freezing night air, settling into his chest as he slid the phone back into his coat pocket. The single line offered no path to redemption or romantic reunion, but it carried a clean, absolute closure that allowed him to finally lay down the crushing burden of the past 5 years. He turned away from Prescott Tower and walked down the rain-slicked block toward the waiting SUV, his mechanical strides carrying a new, quiet sense of internal discipline. Dolan immediately stepped out of the driver's seat and held the rear door open without a single word of inquiry, and Luca climbed into the warm, isolated cabin as the vehicle pulled smoothly into the midnight Manhattan traffic. The illuminated image of the skyscraper quickly receded behind the water-streaked glass, but Luca did not turn his head to track its departure. He kept his eyes fixed strictly on the vast, glowing expanse of the road ahead. He had permanently lost the one magnificent woman who had loved him before he was ever a man worth loving, and he fully understood that he would have to live with that hoitik for the rest of his natural life. Yet, he refused to let the heavy weight of that understanding shrink his character or make his leadership smaller. Instead, he would let it make him Kanchang-hun, more present in his operations, and infinitely more curious about the people who placed their loyalty in his hands. For the last 3 weeks, he had already begun aggressively restructuring his entire syndicate, using the precise legal protocols and structural corrections Evelyn had left behind in his servers to safely sever his high-risk Luxembourg debt loops. He had forced Marco Altieri back into a renegotiated peer alliance from a position of reduced leverage, proving to his capos that he was still a leader worth staying for. This newfound Thosuit was not a path to spiritual absolution, but it was the next true thing to execute. And he would continue stacking true actions until the accumulation became something worth calling a life. High above the silent, rain-washed streets, inside the ruck-row warmth of the 42nd floor, Evelyn Prescott remained at her desk, her mind entirely focused on the next grand architecture she was building. She did not look out the glass window at the vanishing taillights of his vehicle, because she already knew exactly what the world outside was worth. And, this time, completely and independently, her name alone would command it. The profound transformation we witness in Evelyn Prescott's journey carries a devastatingly powerful lesson about the nature of true human capability and strategic brilliance. In a world that constantly demands loud self-assertion, Evelyn reminds us that real power doesn't need an audience to be absolute. For 5 years, she endured the systemic disrespect and arrogant short-sightedness of the Moretti family, not because she was helpless, but because she possessed the profound emotional discipline to stay quiet while she observed their structural flaws. She never wasted her energy on petty arguments or premature displays of anger. She simply focused on becoming the master architect of their entire infrastructure, ensuring that her value was absolute even when their blindness rendered it invisible. When the crisis point arrived and they attempted to humiliate her through a cold, publicly hone, she didn't react with fragility or desperation. She paid the immediate price for total composure, packed her dignity into a single suitcase, and walked out into the storm because she understood that your self-worth can never be negotiated with people who are too small to look at you clearly. This story forces us to look directly into the mirror and re-examine how we handle our own personal and professional boundaries. It teaches us that trithuk, competence, and a highly disciplined mind are the only assets that no institution can ever confiscate from you through a rigged contract. Money can shift and relationships can collapse, but the architectural brilliance inside your head belongs exclusively to you. Evelyn's choice to implement a doctrine of mutually assured disclosure instead of launching a cheap, vengeful attack is the ultimate testament to high EQ leadership. She protected her creation to the very last second, proving that a sovereign individual operates with honor even when surrounded by monsters. Let this narrative serve as a critical reminder. Never correct your adversaries when they are busy making a catastrophic mistake based on their own arrogance. And never allow the temporary blindness of others to make you hold your own light smaller. Build your empire in absolute quiet. Secure your personal circuit breakers. And let your results rewrite the gravity of the market. This comprehensive long-form content was meticulously researched, structured, and manually edited by our expert narrative team to deliver deep strategic insights, high conversion psychological tension, and profound human values. Our goal is to craft immersive stories that not only maximize audience retention, but also leave you with actionable wisdom to navigate the complexities of power, respect, and self-determination in your own life. Thank you for staying until the very last word. It genuinely means everything. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. More elite stories like this one are coming.